Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And today I have two great guests, Dale A. Jenkins and Steve Kemper, and we are going to be talking about their books because they have, wow, I love their books, both of them. Our Man in Tokyo by Steve Kemper and Diplomats and Admirals by Dale A. Jenkins. And just to introduce the subject a little bit, I have this little recording to show you. And then we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to let them just run with it because they know this story so well. Not only have they done years of research and beautiful writing for these wonderful books, they've also had an opportunity to do a lot of talking. But now we have a chance here on YouTube Live that we can see them. So here we go. Okay, guys. Well, I've opened it for you because, as you saw, I gave you some dates. And most people don't understand that it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. That was not the beginning. There was so much that happened before, back in 1921, back in 1927, perhaps, because we're going to talk about something that they say happened, and I'm going to get your opinion on it. But also, of course, very important, 1931, September 18th, when Japan invaded Manchuria. So you guys know so much about the subject, and I want you to really just run with it and have fun with it, talk about it, because in these troubled times, it would be nice if people would know more about history in general, if more of our leaders would read these books. I don't know if everybody at the War College has a copy of your books. Each one of them should have a copy of your books because you tell the story. You don't have to be a historian to enjoy these books because you are both fantastic writers. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that people would have an opportunity to just learn something. And perhaps our leaders would learn something too. What do you think, guys? Okay, here are your books.
I'll jump in, Dale, and then just butt in any time. Let's interrupt each other at will if we can. Um, I think you're right. It'd be great if leaders read history. Sometimes we have leaders who read history, and usually we don't. And I think that is a problem. It's important to understand that for leaders and for everybody to understand, history is not some dry subject that's rational. It's decisions made moment by moment by human beings who have agendas and they have ambitions and they have prejudices, and it's all in the heat of the moment. And when history is told well and people understand that, it makes it come alive for the reader, but it also makes readers realize how perilous each moment can be in a fraught situation like the one we're talking about. What do you think, Dale?
Yep. Yep. Well, I think that Steve did a great job in his book. I learned so much reading this about how Ambassador Grew was able to understand the complexities of the situation when other people, such as our Secretary of State Hall, did not. And in addition to Ambassador Grew's understanding of this situation, Steve was able to dissect it further and project the implications of the various ingredients that went into documents, went into negotiations, and went into the complexity of events. And so it's a book that everybody in the State Department, everybody involved in foreign affairs should read.
Well, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to have the two of you on to talk. Now, you go back in history, and if you look at the founding fathers, for example, they read a lot. If you look at John Adams, of course, Jefferson, they were reading all the time, even while they were running the country, even while they were running a revolution. They were always reading, and they were always learning, and they were always analyzing. Unfortunately, I don't know how many books a politician reads anymore. Do they have time to read? And I think there should be time set aside for them to read. for them to learn from history, because unfortunately, just as we see now in in the Ukraine, whoever would have thought there was going to be another ground war? And you know, it almost boggles the mind. And so that's why I really think that it's important that the two of you talk, and hopefully we'll get a lot of listeners who will say, okay, we have to look at the warning signs. And when I say, 1931 was as important to understand as 1941, and there were some other years in between. And one of them, of course, is I put 1927 in there because I thought maybe I would love your opinion about the Tanaka Memorial. So you have all this background knowledge, and let's see. You just run with it.
Well,
I
uh,
can't, I can't remember. Go ahead, Dale.
well, a lot of people in the United States would say, when did the war begin? The war began when they bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, that was the time for military action. But unfortunately, there was a lot that occurred before that time. And I would say up until 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, we had a chance to avoid the war. It was all there to be done. But that's getting a little bit ahead of our story. When you think about how the Japanese were expanding, how GRU was warning constantly over this expansion and what we could possibly do about it. He was encouraging negotiations, which Cordell Hull really didn't want any part of. He was just oriented towards China. He had behind him a guy named Stanley Hornbeck as an advisor, who was just a committed uh, advocate for China and just hated the Japanese. He had no time. And behind Hornbeck was Alger Hiss, who later was shown to be a spy for Russia. And if you're a spy for Russia, the best thing that could happen would be a war between Japan and the United States, which would give Russia a chance to come in and pick up the pieces. GRU had a very difficult time getting through, and he was constantly sidelined. He would write memorandums that were ignored. Discussions would go on in Washington that he was not informed about. And illustrative of that was how GRU, at one point, and perhaps even more than once, had to go to the British ambassador in Tokyo in order to find out what our State Department, Hull and the others, were saying to the Japanese ambassador in Washington. And why was this necessary? It was necessary because our State Department kept the British ambassador in Washington informed of what was going on, who would then inform the Foreign Secretary in Washington, the Foreign Secretary in London. The Foreign Secretary in London would inform his ambassador in Tokyo, and that ambassador, Sir Robert Craigie, would then kindly enough inform GRU as to what was happening. It was a ridiculous situation and was
Well,
heading for
Steve
trouble.
definitely knows all about this, right, Steve? Tell us a little bit about how you decided to write this book in the first place when you got interested in Admiral GRU and wrote the story.
Okay. Uh, I want to do that, but I can't wait to get to later on. Dale referred to it. Could the war have been stopped? And I think Dale feels more strongly than I do that it was possible to stop it. So that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about with you, Dale. But as far as how I got interested in GRU, I read a book called In the Garden of Beasts by what's his name? Somebody help me here. He's a great nonfiction writer,
I can't
best-selling
think
writer.
of it.
He wrote a book about the ambassador to Germany during the early 30s, and as Nazism was on the rise, and Germany was starting to go slowly insane with the disease of Nazism. And I finished that book, and I thought, who was our man in Tokyo? And that's what led me to look up and discover Joseph GRU. And then I found that he'd been there for 10 years. It was there when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, and that there hadn't been a book about him since the early 1960s. And so as a writer, you think. And he had kept a journal while he was in Tokyo. It was 6,000 pages long. It was all at Harvard. Of course, there's all the dispatches from the State Department, which Dale's very familiar with, back and forth. All of Gru's letters are at Harvard, all of his speeches. And very helpful for me, he had a clipping service and he kept clips from every year that he was in Japan, not only from US papers, but especially important for me, from Japanese papers written in English, a couple of them, but also translations of the main Japanese papers. And so I got a ground level view from the embassy, from Gru, and also from journalists who were covering the story as it developed. And that's what helps to give a book immediacy, the feeling that you're going through it. It's not history, it's happening now. And I'm hoping that what my book does is make you think, surely somebody's going to stop this before it gets to Pearl Harbor, even though we all know nobody did. But it's very suspenseful and infuriating, in fact, to read this stuff and realize, as Dale points out often in his book, there were opportunities to avoid this, and we missed them all. So did the Japanese, by the way, missed even more than we did.
Yeah.
Well, both of you, you've written about this period so beautifully. And of course, for Steve, I mean, this is a big gift to get 6,000 pages. I mean, it's so wonderful. A gift to an author through history that you have this material to work with, because it's not always so easy. I know, Dale, you've spent a lot of time doing research, and reading this source material is, I mean, that is part of the joy of writing, isn't it? That you have this fun of reading all of this original material.
Well, it is, sure. We ought to pick up on some of the events that occurred, and the personalities are really significant. Um, if I have the pronunciation correct, is it Kanoe, Steve?
I think so. Yeah.
Kanoe,
Yeah.
okay. Um, it seems sort of illogical, but let's accept that, and I'll do my best to keep to that. Here's a guy that never wanted to be prime minister. He was an aristocrat. He was happy in the more senior position in the aristocracy. He was prevailed upon to be prime minister. Oddly enough, I thought he could prevent war, but he had not capable of preventing the war. He was prime minister for a year and a half, then was out for a year approximately, came back in the middle of 1940, appointed this guy Pantsuka to be foreign minister. And Matsuka just had dreams of glory for himself. Smart, tough guy, but he thought he was going to end up prime minister himself and then end up on a par with, Stalin and Russia and Hitler and Roosevelt. He was going to be one of the great men of the world if he could just pull off some diplomatic brilliant coups. And he was on his way with his tripartite pact in the fall of 1940, a neutrality pact with Stalin in the spring of 1941. He thought he was safe to have the army move down through Southeast Asia. He overplayed his hand. He got removed in the middle of 1941, but it was not before he had set in motion some very difficult situations which led directly to war. There was Joseph Grew himself, I think, was. I think if you look back at a guy that was just a devoted diplomat, nobody's perfect, and I think that in the spring of 1941, when he was scheduled to go on leave, go to Washington, and he decided to cancel that. And I'd be interested in your views on this, Steve. He canceled his furlough in order to stay on top of the situation in Tokyo. But he knew that he was being sidelined. He knew that he wasn't on top of the dialogue between Roosevelt and Hull, such as Roosevelt had time to devote to it. And I think he should have maintained his plan to go on furlough and go to Washington directly and have it out with Roosevelt one-on-one, because they did have the relationship from Harvard and from other involvements. He had the opportunity to do that.
So what do you think?
And later on, when Kanoe suggested the summit meeting between himself and Roosevelt, by this time we're into August, September. And at one point, there had even been a tentative date set up for Juneau, Alaska, September 21 to 23, when they were going to meet. And Hull and the other people in the War Council, Stimson, Knox, Ickes, they managed to kibosh it. They said to Roosevelt, the guy doesn't have the power to really put into effect whatever he might be able to do. And the fact is, he probably did. But that's when, again, when this was a showdown situation, I wish Grew would have just gotten on an airplane, whether it was the chartered Pan Am Clipper or whatever it was, gone to Washington and seen it through, because that was the crucial time. And I really believe, and as Grew believed, and as he wrote in the letter after the war began, had that summit occurred, the war could have been and probably would have been avoided. They could have come to an agreement, and Kanoe could have forced the government in Japan to agree to what they were going to put forward, because Kanoe was ready to agree with just about anything Roosevelt wanted at that point.
So Steve,
I'd like to hear what Steve thinks.
Yes, Steve, let's give a little backstory here to Admiral Grew, because his understanding of the Japanese was very deep. He explained when he arrived in Japan how he took this position and really ran with it. He wanted to know about the Japanese. He wanted to understand them. He was a great ambassador, because lots of these ambassadors who go to these countries, they don't care. Tell us about those early years from 1932 on.
Well, he was sent there initially by President Herbert Hoover after the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, because Grew was a Republican. Hoover was a Republican, of course. And Grew was the most experienced, trustworthy diplomat we had, and Japan was considered the most difficult mission in the world at the time, because this was before Hitler really got going. The Japanese got started before Hitler did. So he went there, and his command was to get Japan out of Manchuria. And it took Grew about a month to realize that's never going to happen. And so he began focusing on other ways that he could keep Japan in the conversation, keep them in good relations with America, so that at some point down the line, maybe diplomacy could have an effect on Japan's conduct. And you're right, he went into it the way he always went into his post, with great enthusiasm for the host country. And he wrote about this. He said, any ambassador who doesn't go into it with an open mind and a willingness to learn about the culture and to meet them from their perspective is going to fail. And but that became a problem in the 1930s, when it became an issue when anybody tried to meet the perspective of what were coming to be perceived as our enemies. And so Grew was eventually accused by people in the State Department of being an appeaser, of being naive, because he tried to see things from the Japanese point of view, while also relaying to the Japanese government the serious complaints and protest of the U.S. government about Japanese policies. So he wasn't, contrary to what a lot of historians have written about Grew, he was not somebody who had tread marks on his back. The guy stood up for everything important, but he also wanted to compromise where possible without giving away the store. And Hull was not sophisticated enough to do anything like that. He was an absolutist. He was a idealist. With his values were firm, rigid. And you can't have rigid values if you're going to engage in diplomacy. It just doesn't work. That's a process of finding mutual self-interest. which means compromise. And of course, as we know, that's become a dirty word. And it became a dirtier and dirtier word in politics in the 1930s, especially after Hitler and Munich and all that.
That was
Um,
appeasement. Yeah.
yeah. But I want to go back to something you mentioned, Dale, about Grew not going home on his leave. That's an interesting point of view. If when he did come home after he was released from internment, when the hostages on each side were released, and he came back to Washington, and he complained to Hull that why didn't you have this meeting? It was so important. It could have made a difference. And Hull said, if it was so important, why didn't you get on a plane and come tell us? And Grew's response was, because it was too intense over there. You needed me there. And I think that would be his answer for early 1941 too. Things were really heating up in early 1941. And Grew was, in fact, requested by the foreign minister, please don't go home. We need you to stay here. This is a crucial time. And Grew said, okay, I'm going to stay at my post. So I think I'd push back on you a little on that. He reacted like any conscientious diplomat would, because you got to remember, it's not like you get on a direct flight from Tokyo to Washington. It was a very long journey in those days, and so
Yeah.
he would have lost a month of important developments going back and forth, and I'm not sure he would have made any difference. I mean, if you and you point this out in your book, and it's so aggravating. He was doing what he could. He was sending all of these dispatches, and they were going into a black hole in the State Department. And
Yeah.
so instead of reaching his friend and President Roosevelt, so he did write a letter to him, directly to him, in September 1941 about this meeting, saying, this is important and you really should do this, and it may be our last chance. And Roosevelt ignored it. He sent it by wire directly to Roosevelt, who just put it aside, and then eventually gave it to Hull and said, you reply to this. But it was a month later. And by that point, that was it. The Japanese were no longer interested in meeting with Roosevelt. Tojo was the prime minister, and that opportunity had sailed. Yeah.
Well, in
Well,
January of 1941, I want to show you this picture. In January of 1941, Yamamoto was already making speeches, and so Hull was, well, we'll talk about Hull in a minute, but Ambassador Grew knew what Yamamoto was saying, that Yamamoto knew there was going to be a war. It was so clear, and yet people were completely ignoring it and ignoring the fact that, what year was it that America destroyed 60% of their battleships because they were looking for peace? And the Japanese were not looking for peace, and they were planning long in advance, for the war.
Well,
well,
go ahead, Dale.
uh, well, that we're getting into the military part of this, the naval part. But just to try to answer that briefly, Yamamoto did not want a war. He did not want the tripartite pact. He did not want an alliance with Germany. And he knew that in a war that was at all protracted, Japan would lose. So, faced with a dilemma, he decided that there's only one way, if war comes, to beat the United States, and that's to beat them on the first day. And if you don't do that, you lose. And that's what he was doing with the Pearl Harbor attack. The Pearl Harbor attack was not as powerful as it had to be or could have been. But nevertheless, that was the first day, and the war continued after that.
Now, did Admiral Grew meet with Yamamoto or ever encounter him in his diplomatic relationship, Steve?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Grew knew everybody important in Tokyo, and he knew Yamamoto right from the beginning. Yamamoto was he's the lead person in the renegotiation of the naval treaty, as Dale can tell you. You were talking about the tonnages, and there was a treaty that was an attempt to keep the peace, to keep the powers from having a naval buildup. And Japan, I believe it was 1932 or 34, I think, refused to renegotiate that treaty. And
Yeah.
Yamamoto was the lead negotiator for that. So Grew knew him well from that. He knew him, and then from onwards, when Yamamoto was the assistant to the premier, the Navy minister,
And
the
then the
Navy.
ministry.
And of course, Yamamoto was in America, so he understood Americans.
He was.
Well,
And there was, I think the opportunity for the summit was so unusual and so powerful. It was unthinkable that a Japanese prime minister would leave the country, let alone go to the United States or United States territory. But he was desperate to do that. He was desperately trying to avoid a war. He had been manipulated by the army. He was not a strong guy. He never wanted the job in the first place. But the fact is, he made this incredible effort for this summit, which Hull and Hornbeck and Alger Hiss kiboshed, and never occurred. Could have been, the whole thing could have been different.
Yeah.
And Steve, when you were researching, did you come across the letter at the Harvard Museum, which was written in after the war began, the 12-page letter
Oh yeah.
that yeah, I think you and I and maybe one or two other people are the only ones that have ever seen that. Because
That's a fascinating letter.
had the
It's
summit
he
occurred.
wrote,
And this was a covering letter against over his final report. And the final report, as I understand it, has never been found. But the covering letter did survive, but it was never sent. It was addressed to Roosevelt. It was signed, an ink signature. Your loyal, ambassador, whatever he said, ink signature Joseph Grew. But on the top of the first page of 12 pages, there was a pencil notation, not sent. And so it was never sent. It ended up in Grew's papers, which he turned over to Harvard after he died. And they're there now.
Steve,
Uh,
did FDR ever reach out to Ambassador Grew personally? Did he ever? I mean, they knew each other.
yes, they knew each other. They were not only at Harvard together, they were in the same club together. Grew was actually 2 years older than Roosevelt. He was a senior when Roosevelt was a sophomore. They were in the same club. They knew each other.
yeah,
But
they
So
weren't
the
Steve,
good.
fact
They
that
weren't friends,
there was a letter that, and I think it's the one that you're referring to, Steve, Grew, this would have been about, I think, somewhere around the beginning of September 1941. The exact date's gone out of my mind. 4-page letter, which was just laid out all the facts as clearly as he possibly could. And it was the one occasion when he might have just bypassed the Secretary of State. An
but
ambassador has to send everything into a Secretary of State. That's the law. But that one time he might have bypassed and sent, for your eyes only, sent it
he
directly to Roosevelt.
did do that.
You think he
He,
did that? Okay.
I know he did that. I mean, that's Grew said he did, and he said the reasons why he did it, which are just the ones that you're talking about. And he expected to get a reply from his friend and president, and waited and never got it until he got a form letter from the State Department signed by somebody.
and
Yeah.
and so it went to Cordell Hull, who
No,
wants
it went. I think that Roosevelt got the letter, and either whether he read it or ignored it, whether he somehow it got misplaced or his assistant didn't give it to him, but Grew sent it directly to him. It was a telegram, and in those days you didn't send telegrams unless it was urgent, and Grew sent it by telegram, so it was expensive, and that's why you didn't do it. And it went right to him, but he didn't get a reply. And then it's in the records where Roosevelt turned it over to Hull and said, "Take care of this for me," and Hull turned it over to a subordinate who sent a form letter back thank you for your letter to the President Roosevelt, so on. It's
Yeah.
terrible.
Well, it's just typical of the communications that were going on there. Completely ineffective.
Steve, did the ambassador have any relationship at all with Cordell Hull? Did he communicate directly to him? I mean, that's really how he was supposed to do it, right?
Oh yeah, he constantly was sending dispatches straight to Hull. But when it got to the State Department, it had to go through the State Department pipeline before it reached Hull's desk. So first it would go to the Far East desk, and then they would decide what to do with it. And maybe it went through Stanley Hornbeck. If it got through the Far East desk, it went through Stanley Hornbeck, Hull's chief advisor on Far Eastern affairs. And then Hornbeck, whether if he didn't like it, then he would put his snarky rebuttals and dismissals on it before he gave it to Hull. So by the time it got to Hull, it had been touched by several hands, several minds, and several prejudices. And so Hull had that to deal with by the time he.
Yeah,
And
that's
some of
about
the
right.
hands were Elger Hiss.
I don't, not in the State Department. I don't believe it. He wasn't in the pipeline for that. But I wouldn't be surprised at all, and maybe Dale knows about this. I wouldn't be surprised if he saw things because he and Hornbeck were tight. What do you think about that, Dale?
Well, I think Hull and Storm and uh, Hornbeck were tight. I mean, Hull was really not a professional diplomat at all. He'd been most of his career in Congress. When he was Secretary of State, because he was instrumental in bringing some southern states into the column in the 1932 election. His reward for that was to be Secretary of State. And
Mm.
the curious thing about Roosevelt, once people were in the cabinet, they stayed. There were people that were there for 12 years. Um, and uh, Hull had some experience with South America, some, better, good relations or good, whatever it was with South America. He never had any experience with Europe and certainly not anything with the Far East. So
He was,
he
he was
didn't
a
really
trade
know.
specialist. He was his specialty was international trade, and that's what he knew the most about. And so that
Yeah.
was his international experience. But that doesn't have much to do at all, as you said, with diplomacy. And he was not.
But
Like,
I think with our time left, I really think it's important to focus on the last few weeks because in the Tojo became prime minister and he realized Japan could not win a war. He was desperately looking for an agreement with the United States. Togo, Togo, not to be confused with Tojo. Um, he was sending messages constantly. We've got to have an agreement. We've got to have an agreement. And the magic decoding system that the U.S. had was reading all this stuff. They
mm,
knew perfectly well that the Japanese wanted an agreement to avoid a war. And this went on right through the month of November. Nomura, the ambassador there, was bolstered by Caruso, a guy that was a Japanese experienced diplomat. They were trying to do whatever they could to avoid a war. Finally, in the middle of November, the Japanese agreed to withdraw from the southern part of Indochina, which was what had precipitated the asset freeze and what turned into, thanks to Dean Acheson, an oil embargo. And so with that option on the table to withdraw from southern Indochina, the other side of the agreement was a resumption of oil shipments. And this was on the table. And Hull said, I got to circulate a draft around to the British, the Dutch, and the Chinese. And so the Dutch, one way or the other, they were occupied by Hitler by that time anyway. They were operating, out of London. They weren't uh, effective in that situation. Uh, Churchill had serious misgivings about it. He was afraid that a one-on-one agreement between the U.S. and Japan might leave them still exposed in Singapore. So he had his doubts about it. Chiang Kai-shek came through adamantly opposed, and I think it's worth reading. This is out of the Foreign Relations to the United States Diplomatic Papers. This is from Chiang Kai-shek. If there is any relaxation of the embargo or freezing regulations, or if a belief of that gains ground, then the Chinese people would consider that China has been completely sacrificed by the United States. The entire people will collapse, the Chinese army will collapse, and that loss of such will not be to China alone. In other words, you'll have to pick up the pieces. This adamant declaration, Madam Chiang and her brother, Dr. Soong, papered Washington with telegrams, anybody they could think of that could possibly lend some weight behind this. A telegram went to Churchill. It was leaked to the press, and it came out, Hull is trying to appease the Japanese. And Ickes, the Secretary of State, said, if there's an agreement with Japan, I will resign and create a big stink, whatever it was. And Hull was staggered by that, staggered. And he said, I can't possibly go along with this thing now if our trusted allies agree with it. So what did he do? He substituted a long-term agreement that had been drafted by several weeks in advance, which was just a, a, a long-term goal over 2 to 5 years of what they might hope to achieve, which was a complete withdrawal by the Japanese from Indochina, a complete withdrawal from China, which of course the Japanese were trying to do. They were bogged down, they were losing tons of troops, they were looking for a way out. There'd be no other government in China except Chiang Kai-shek. They'd revoked the Tripartite Pact, so forth. But the big thing was this total withdrawal, which had nothing to do with the discussions that had taken place up to that time.
Well, Steve,
So,
explain the relationship between the State Department and China, and what did Grew think about it? What did he think would be the outcome of these negotiations?
Well, what did
What
Gru?
did Grew think?
Yeah, well, he knew that there was a China cabal, not a cabal. There was a China group in the State Department, and they had far more sway over Hull than the few people in the department that were interested in the Japanese perspective on things. And the China group was led by Hornbeck, so he knew that his views were being undermined. As soon as they got to the State Department, they were being chopped to pieces by a number of different people. And of course, but he always hoped that negotiations would proceed and go through. And he didn't even know about this plan that Hull had concocted, this modus vivendi that he showed the Allies, and that Dale very correctly says he caved in on, because as soon as the Allies started to complain, Hull lost his temper, which was his habit, and blamed them instead of standing up for his own plan. But Dale left out here, although not in his book, that the other thing that pushed him over the edge was that they had reports of massive troop movements in Southeast Asia. Naval transport ships were moving at the same time that Japan was saying, we want peace. So despite the stuff that Dale was saying about these intercepts showing that they wanted peace, the intercepts were also showing that Japan was moving ahead full speed with its plans for more aggression in case the peace plans didn't work out. So Japan was playing, and by that point, Hull had it up to here. I mean, Japan had broken so many promises, every promise, and had just run through so many stop signs, caution signs that we had put up, that Hull didn't believe a word they had to say. And it's why, and it is a tragedy. It's the word that Dale uses, and I agree with it. It's a tragedy that Hull didn't take seriously that offer for Cournoyer to meet with Roosevelt, because he didn't believe that Cournoyer could pull it off. He thought it was a trick. He never took it that seriously because all he could think of was how deceitful the Japanese had been for the last 7 years. And in that way, I don't blame him. But it's another case of him being unimaginative and not listening to Grew, who said, "No, I know this man." Grew knew Cournoyer very well, and he said he's sincere. He has his people lined up, and he wants this to happen. He can't lose face again. He wants to go and come back with something for Japan. And Hull said, "He's a liar. I don't believe it. I'm going to kill this idea." And that's what he did.
And of course,
Yep.
in Washington, D.C., the Chinese were very active. Explain what was happening in Washington, D.C. with the Chinese
just
and Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
no, just to go back to where we were, Hull took this longer-term agreement. He said, "Okay, I can't give him this short-term modus vivendi, as they called it, so I have to give him something else." So he pulled out this long-term agreement, which I just described, and he gave that to the Japanese, and the Japanese sent that back to Tokyo. Now, meanwhile, there had been a deadline. Why was there a deadline? Because we were rearming, building ships, planes, and all that rest. We had cut off the oil to Japan. The Japanese army had said, and Navy had said, "Look, the United States is getting stronger. We're getting weaker. There's got to be a deadline." The deadline turned out to be November 30th. Okay? If there's not a diplomatic agreement by then, it's war. Their ships got underway on the 25th because they had decided that if there's going to be a war, various combinations of things, whether it's tides or currents or moon or whatever, December 8th and December 7th in the United States is when they're going to hit Pearl Harbor. And there was an equivalent movement down through Southeast Asia. The ships had to be underway from the northern Japanese islands on the 26th of November in order to get all the way across the Pacific Ocean. But they had to get a specific order to proceed. There was that code word, climb Mount Niitaka. If they didn't get that, they were going to reverse course and go back. So they were underway. The long-term agreement was delivered to Tokyo. The government in Tokyo said, "This is nothing like what we've been hearing about." And in addition to that, it's insulting because it's arrogant. And so they decided there's been no progress, no solution for diplomacy. And at that point, and it was the 2nd of December, the word goes out to the fleets already underway. In the case of the Pacific, climb Mount Niitaka, and Pearl Harbor is a couple of days later.
What time was that in Japan when Pearl Harbor happened?
December
Steve,
8th.
I know December 8th, but what time? What Ambassador Grew doing? What time was it for
Well,
him?
it would have been
And Steve, was his wife with him at the time? She was still
Yeah,
in Japan?
the exact time I'd have to check back in my notes, but I know that Togo, who was the foreign minister, got word from the Navy that the mission had been a total success, and that was like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. He had gotten home and he was waiting for a phone call from the Navy, and he got it, and it was a complete success. Grew was asleep, but when he woke up at about 7 o'clock in the morning, he already had a note from Togo saying, "Please come see me right away this morning." And Grew thought that he was being summoned to hand FDR's final note to Emperor Hirohito, begging Hirohito not to keep moving troops, not to do what it looked like Japan was going to do, which was to have further aggression in the Far East. Little did Roosevelt know, of course, that it was Pearl Harbor. So Grew got up and he thought, I'm going to deliver this note from FDR to Hirohito. They really jumped on that because he had been at the foreign minister's house at midnight the night before. But when he went over to see Togo, all he did was hand him a statement saying, "We're calling off negotiations. I'm sorry. Goodbye." And Grew left thinking, "Well, I guess we'll start up again next week." And he went back to the embassy, put on his golfing clothes to play golf, and heard the newsboys in the street yelling, "Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. We're at war with the United States." And that's how
Wow.
Grew found out about Pearl Harbor.
And was his wife still in Japan? She
Yeah,
was
she
there?
was one of the few women. She was one of the few women still left in the embassy. Many of the women and children had been sent home because the State
Yeah,
Department had warned them something.
yeah.
You should come home if you're not a vital uh, personnel. Then come home because it's starting to get dangerous. Even though nobody in the State Department, till the very last moments, believed that Japan could possibly attack the United States, but they were afraid that they might attack the embassy. So they had people come home.
So were they arrested by the Japanese at that point?
Yeah,
Ah,
they were interned. The gates were shut. Nobody was allowed to leave, and that was it for the next 6 months. They spent 6 months in the embassy waiting for the negotiations to proceed, so that the Japanese diplomats, who were, by the way, interned in a posh country club in West Virginia, had all the food and everything that they wanted, all the heat, things that were the Americans did not have all the food and heat that they wanted. They did have Grew's extensive wine cellar, and Grew said, I'm damned if I'm going to leave the wine for the Japanese." So he started distributing that wine over the next 6 months to all the messes in the embassy. And there was wine left after 6 months. So that gives you some idea of the extent of his wine collection. A little sidelight.
They
oh,
failed to drink it all.
yeah. Although after Pearl Harbor, you might want to drink a lot.
I'm sure they did their best.
Yeah. Well, it's so nice that you've joined me for this conversation. I think it's an important conversation. As I said, I'm hoping that we can just encourage people to read, and particularly, I hope that this book can get to some of the people who are decision makers. I know they're all running for election and stuff, but there are times, you have to really understand what's going on in the world, really see what's happened. All of the decisions we made in the past that were wrong, unfortunately, we always say learn from history, and it looks like so much of it we haven't learned from history. But
Mm.
perhaps your books will open eyes, because the fact that
It's nice.
we had a spy in the State Department, an active, very active spy, um,
Mm.
and who helped to change policy simply by influencing Hornbeck, who influenced Hull, and all of these things, all of these warning signals that we had that were ignored. It's frightening to think about it. I don't know what they're doing at Annapolis and all of the war colleges and all of the military, but there should be a course. The two of you should be called there to teach a course. Are you speaking at any of the military colleges?
No.
Well, I'm trying to be in touch with as much as I can.
Have you been invited to talk to any of the graduating classes? Because you two would make fascinating speeches at one of these commencements, where you would talk really about the importance of leadership and the importance of knowing something about mistakes in the past.
Well, I've been to Naval Order and Navy League events. In August, I go out to Ferguson, Texas, which is the birthplace of Admiral Nimitz, which is now the Pacific War Museum. They're having a symposium on the Battle of Midway, which is going to go on for several weeks. It's just one weekend after another. I can't imagine what they're going to be doing for all these weeks till I get there, but nevertheless, I'm scheduled there for August 26 and 27.
Mm.
If I may say so, I think I'm the first person that understood Admiral Nimitz's battle plan for Midway, which was not followed for various reasons. you miscommunications, misevaluations, and so forth. We managed to win it. The Battle of Midway, one of the great naval wins of all time in the history of the U.S. Navy, was a broken play. It was like the Kansas City Chiefs. Mahomes supposed to be giving a handoff to a running back. The running back misses the ball. Mahomes is left holding the ball. He's running back 15 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Two linebackers are chasing him back. He heaves a Hail Mary into the end zone and touchdown. That's how we won the Battle of Midway.
Well, Dale, I'll have you back in August and we can talk about that event. And meanwhile, Steve, what are you working on?
I'm working on figuring out how to retire. I think I'm
Steve, I did
72.
retire. This is my second career for me.
Ah, okay. Well, my retirement won't include writing another heavy book. I'll tell you that.
Your book took quite a while and lots of research.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that my book won an award from the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is it's like the National Academy of Movies. It's a bunch of people you have to be accomplished to get in, and they said my book was the best book about diplomacy of the year. So that was a good thing to hear, because they're the people who know the territory. And so that means I hope that a lot of foreign service people probably noticed my book and maybe they're reading it. I think Gru's a good example for foreign service officers. And so maybe it'll have some influence that way.
Well, thank you both for joining me
Yeah,
today on Joy on Paper Live. It's nice to be able to do this, to bring you together, because I want to encourage people to read more and definitely to read your books, because they're both great books. And again, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me.
thank you, Patsy.
Okay, it's been a joy to talk to you. Bye-bye now. And it was indeed a joy to talk to them. They are both so, it is so much fun when you find books like this. They're nonfiction, but I tell you, they are so readable. Both of them have a wonderful writing style. They've done a lot of research, but they managed to put it in such a way that you don't even think about it. What you think about is the exciting story that they're telling. And both of them, Diplomats and Admirals, I found chapters in there where I was holding my breath. Now I know the outcome. I mean, I know what's going to happen, but still, the way that Dale Jenkins captured the moment, I was like, what's going to happen to Doolittle? I mean, it's so funny. I was just absolutely thrilled with it, and of course, our man in Tokyo. Well, when you think about it, you know, Ambassador Gru has been mostly forgotten, maybe because people don't want to know all the mistakes that they made in not paying attention from 1932 to 1941 when he was there and he was trying to get the message across. But Steve mentioned his book is heavy. Well, it's a little thick, but it reads, again, it's well laid out, beautifully written, and it's just a fun read. So if you're thinking, oh well, I don't know if I want to read nonfiction, read these nonfiction books. One, because they tell us a lot about leadership. They reflect upon the mistakes, and they also talk about perhaps things that we could do better in the future. And if you have, you should send it to your congressman. Each of these books should go to your congressman, because perhaps they'll read it, perhaps they'll learn something, because definitely they have to learn something. We keep making the same mistakes over and over and over. And as Steve mentioned, he won really a very prestigious award from the American Academy of Diplomacy, and there it is, and it's really something very special. And again, part of it is because the book is so readable. You will enjoy this book. I hope you'll get it. And, here you can contact both of them. They have websites. Dale's is daleajenkins.com, and Steve's is stevekemper.net. And they have, particularly Steve has some very great blogs there that you can read. And both of them are so knowledgeable. Isn't it fun when you see somebody who knows their subject and they don't need notes? It's just, they know it. It's sort of at their fingertips. And they've, both of them did years of research, and they lived with these characters. And that's why when I say characters, it's because the books read like they are characters from a book, a novel. And so I hope you'll get these books. They're really, really great reads. And again, Dale A. Jenkins and Steve Kemper, thank you so much for being on Joy on Paper, because you both have written books that I enjoyed so much. And that's what we want. We want books that people enjoy and books that people will get. So again, thank you for joining me. And I want to have some more conversations, again, with other nonfiction authors who have spent a great deal of time, devoted years of research, and have written great books that I want to bring to you. So to do that, I need your help. I want to ask you, there's so many ways that people try to get money from people. It's really difficult, and I hate to do it. So I'm not asking, right? You don't have to give me money, but all you have to do is subscribe. And then, of course, if you're on YouTube, you know the importance of making comments and likes and sharing. And that's all you have to do. And it doesn't cost you a penny. I do have a Patreon page, but that, again, I'm using that to upload my 9 years of interviews with authors on the radio. And those are all free. The radio interviews are all free. And you can go to the Patreon page and not give a penny. Although, if you want, you can give $5, but that's $5 for everybody. So if you're a global best-selling author, you can give me $5. And if you're just starting off writing, you can give me $5. Or if you are a reader, who I really love, you can do that. But you don't have to, because I have had so many wonderful, really fantastic interviews with authors. 12 Mystery Writer of America Grandmaster. So if you're thinking of writing a mystery, I suggest you listen to those those interviews as I get them up. It's taking me a little time. I've been really busy since I started this YouTube channel on St. Patrick's Day, the 9th anniversary of the radio program. And this radio program is still going strong, and I'm using that as a way to meet authors, more authors to bring here to the YouTube channel. So anyway, if you could do that for me, that would be so sweet of you. Just subscribe, like, comment, share, and I forgot to say, I've mentioned this before on other programs. If you have an author you want me to invite, make a comment in the comment box, and if I invite that author, and you're the first person to recommend that author, then I will invite you to be on Joy on Paper Live to say hello. And that would be lots of fun. So you'll get a little while on YouTube, and you'll get a little time to talk to your favorite author. So just make a comment in the comment box, and I look forward to inviting some of your favorite authors. Thank you, and that's all I can say for today. It's been a busy day. Bye-bye now.